All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our class on parenting. This is actually the final lesson of the class. So we will begin a new Sunday school trimester next week. So you've hung in there, you have persevered, and we have now made it to the end. And so let me tell you what the plan is for today. In this final unit of the class, we've been addressing contemporary cultural challenges in parenting. So I looked at the book Them Before Us at the beginning of December, which is about the importance of biology, the importance of gender, and the importance of marriage with respect to parenting. Then Drew spent a couple weeks looking at Jonathan Haidt's new book called The Anxious Generation, which was talking about the rise of mental illness among Gen Z in particular, those born like around 2000 and later. Does anybody remember what were the two main influences for why rates of anxiety and mental illness have been increasing so much among younger people today? He gave two causes. Social media was one of them, and there was a special term he used for the other phenomenon. Safetyism. Safetyism, you know, the idea that we're like overly protective. We don't let our kids go outside as much, not so much free-range parenting anymore. Because of the decline of that, that has had a toll on kids' mental health. So those are recorded. I've already uploaded part one of that to our YouTube channel. Part two, we just finished editing, so I'm going to get that uploaded very quickly. Last week, Pete Hansen talked about the book The Tech-Wise Family by Andy Crouch. There's a lot of wisdom in that little book. We were considering even using it during our summer class on technology, but because it fits so well with the topic of parenting, we decided to hold off and use it for this class instead. Pete did not quite finish covering that whole book. There are still 2 chapters remaining, so I'm going to briefly cover those 2 chapters at the beginning of our lesson today. Then we'll spend the rest of the class talking about this final book you see here on the screen, Handing Down the Faith by Christian Smith and Amy Adamczyk. So this past week or two, I've been reading through this book, which is a work of sociology about the practices of American parents in transmitting their religious faith to their kids. There's a lot that we can learn from this book, and we're going to unpack that together. But first, we'll begin with our discussion on the Tech-Wise family. So here you'll see what Pete covered last week. Part one of the book is about the 3 key decisions of a tech-wise family: choosing character, shaping space, and structuring time. This is also uploaded on YouTube, by the way. So if you missed last week's lesson, you can check our YouTube channel and see this. Part 2, which Pete also covered, is about the practices that we can implement in our daily lives: waking and sleeping, learning and working, the good news about boredom, the deep end of the carpool, and naked and unashamed. Those were the chapters that Pete covered. There's only 2 chapters remaining that he was not able to cover because we ran out of time. But these are kind of the pastoral applications. So not so much about like specific practices regarding technology per se, but just as Christians, what should be our attitude toward technology, and what practices can serve as alternatives to our reliance upon technology. And so I'm going to highlight some of the quotes from these chapters for you so you get the gist. Chapter 9 is called Why Singing Matters. And the chapter begins with Andy Crouch lamenting the loss of singing among people today. It used to be a very common practice among people, even people that were not technically skilled in singing. Everyone did it. It's still definitely more common among churchgoers because, you know, we sing in our worship services. But how often do you sing outside of church? I'm guessing not much at all, right? Never, maybe. Yeah, so it's very rare. That is kind of unprecedented in human society. It used to be people would sing every day. It was just one of the most common pastimes. But what's happened in modern days is our consumption of music has skyrocketed because we have so much more access to it because of technology. But our actual production of music personally, you know, through singing in particular, has plummeted. So both those phenomena have happened simultaneously because of the rise of modern technology. So here's one of the opening quotes from this chapter. Like so much of technology, there is no way to deny that this easy, everywhere abundance of music is a gift. And it has also caused us to forget and neglect what every other generation of human beings in every culture remembered and cultivated: the ability to make music on our own. Sitting in the living room or on the porch singing together, or listening to one another play instruments, was once a normal part of many American families' lives together. Today, I dare say, for the vast majority of American families, it would seem impossibly corny and embarrassing. We can consume more music than they ever did. We create less music than they ever could have imagined. That's the situation we're finding ourselves in. And so Crouch is advocating a recovery of singing, but he's using singing as a stand-in for worship practices more generally. What we need to recover in our lives are practices of worship, which are supremely manifest through the practice of singing. Why is singing so central to corporate worship? Here's what he says. Simply, singing may be the one human activity that most perfectly combines heart, mind, soul, and strength. So does everybody know what the greatest commandment is, according to Jesus? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. How can we do that most effectively? Well, one of the ways we can do that is through singing, because that engages our heart, mind, soul, and strength simultaneously. Almost everything else we do requires at least one of these fundamental human faculties. The heart, the seat of the emotion and the will. The mind, with which we explore and explain the world. The soul, the heart of human dignity and personhood. And strength, our body's ability to bring about change in the world. But singing, and maybe only singing, combines them all. Can you think of any other human activity that combines heart, mind, soul, and strength like singing does? It would be a pretty short list, wouldn't it? And so Crouch is arguing we need to recover the centrality of singing in our lives. And in fact, singing as an alternative to our dependence upon technology. How much more would it enrich our lives if we recovered this ancient human practice of singing? But he's focusing especially on its role in worship as well. So that's my summary of chapter 9. And briefly, I'm going to cover chapter 10 as well. This is the final chapter of the book. It's called In Sickness and in Health. He begins with some anecdotes about his experiences of like attending weddings. And, we sort of intuitively recognize a wedding ceremony is meant to be in person, right? You just kind of lose the significance of a wedding if it's purely virtual, right? Same with like funerals. And there are a lot of human activities in life where it loses a fundamental aspect of its meaning if it's not in person. A lot of human activities are meant to be embodied. And here's what he has to say in this chapter. When we show up, especially in the course of family life, we encounter what technology tries so hard to delay or erase, the limits and fragility of our bodies. So he states this in the context of, human ceremonies like weddings and funerals. This book, as I read this chapter, it occurred to me this book was written pre-COVID. But I imagine that if it had been written post-COVID, he could have come up with another great illustration for this chapter. Virtual communion. That became a big topic of debate among churches since the pandemic, right? Like, will we continue to offer communion virtually? Or will we limit it to the traditional embodied practice of communion? Our church and our denomination has stood for the position that communion is meant to be an embodied practice. If you do it virtually, it's no longer communion. So, when Christ commanded the disciples to take communion, he said, when you gather together, do this in remembrance of me. So we recognize that there is something fundamental about our embodied presence in the practice of communion, where it ceases to be what it's supposed to be if it's no longer in person. So that's why, our denomination cited against the practice of virtual communion. I think that would have been a great example that Crouch could have used in this chapter to highlight the importance of embodied presence. And here's one of the final quotes I'm going to share with you. I think there's a couple slides here to go on this book. Crouch says, the tech-wise family will choose a different way. That is, as an alternative to this virtual existence that we've become so inundated with. We will recognize that our daily bodily vulnerabilities, our illnesses, and our final journey to death are our best chance to reject technology's easy everywhere promise. In other words, technology gives us the illusion of longevity and immortality. It helps us to delay the thoughts of our own finitude and mortality. But the tech-wise family will choose a different way of living. We will embrace something better. The wisdom of knowing our own limits, the courage to care for one another, and just as difficult, the courage to accept one another's care when we cannot care for ourselves. We will put love into practice in the most profound possible way, by being present with one another in person at the greatest and most difficult moments of life. And then the concluding quote that I have for you guys here. We are meant not just for thin virtual connections, but for visceral, real connections to one another in this fleeting, temporary, and infinitely beautiful and worthwhile life. We are meant to die in one another's arms, surrounded by prayer and song, knowing beyond knowing that we are loved. So this is the alternative vision that he is casting compared to like a life that has become dependent upon technology. He wants to recover this ancient way of embodied living and say this is what it means to flourish as a human being. So that is our summary of Andy Crouch's book, The Tech-Wise Family. Pete, do you have any final comments on these last chapters?
No, I'm relationally focused.
That's right. That's right. So these final two chapters, you could summarize like the key takeaways of the final two chapters as singing and embodiment. Those are the two ideas that you take away from those final chapters. All right. Now we can move into our topic for today, which is this book, Handing Down the Faith, How Parents Pass Their Religion On to the Next Generation, by the sociologists Christian Smith and Amy Adamczyk. Now, just curious, how many of you have heard of the name Christian Smith before? He's actually a pretty well-known social scientist. He has written a number of books in the past. One of his more popular books was called Soul Searching, where he coined this expression. How many of you have heard of the term moral therapeutic deism? I'm guessing many of you have heard of that. Okay, so Christian Smith was the one who coined this term. It was based on his study of the spiritual and religious lives of Americans today. And he concluded that the dominant cultural model that Americans have embraced today could be described as moral therapeutic deism. So for those of you that have heard of this term before, how would you define it? What have you heard about this term? If this is the dominant operating principle for Americans today in their religious lives, here's my summary of what Christian Smith would say. The man upstairs concept? Yeah, very much so. That we are basically here on earth to live good and happy lives. God exists, but his role is basically to help us on the path towards moral progress, to ensure that our lives are happy. He does not make high demands of us as long as we live basically decent and good lives. Our life is about pursuing our true selves and being as happy as we can be. And God is there to facilitate that process for us.
God helps those who help themselves.
God helps those who help themselves. Yes, although I've actually looked into that expression. Puritans use that expression too. I think there's an orthodox way to use that concept. That's a whole other topic as well, because there's a Pelagian way that phrase can be interpreted. You guys know what Pelagianism is? Like works righteousness, self-salvation. And that's the bad way of taking it. But helping oneself could mean like by the grace given to us by God, we exert effort, working out our salvation in fear and trembling, right? Taking responsibility for spiritual growth. Dependence upon the Holy Spirit is a part of that, of course. It's not as opposed to reliance upon God's grace, but it's in cooperation with God's grace. There's a whole lot of complicated theology there to dive into, though, because, of course, justification is not a cooperative activity. Sanctification is, though. And so we have to clarify the distinction there. I was not intending to do that theological deep dive today, Todd. Sorry. Let's get back to this. That is kind of a decent summary, though, of how that term is commonly used. Like, God helps those who help themselves. That is a central idea behind this concept of moral therapeutic deism. That human life is about living good and happy lives, and God is there to facilitate that process. Not to exact high demands from us, not to demand a total commitment. So it's a pretty shallow, superficial understanding of religion. And in this book, Smith and his co-author, Amy Adamczyk, who I had not heard of before, but I guess her expertise is in criminal justice, they surveyed several families that were religiously affiliated in America from different religious traditions. And their findings basically reinforced this understanding of American religious life. And you're going to see that as we unpack the contents of this book. So let me just share with you the opening introductory paragraph from the book. This tells you what the book is about. This book is about how American religious parents approach the handing on of their religious practices and beliefs to their children. We know a lot about the importance of parents in faith transmission and factors that influence its effectiveness. But we know much less about the actual beliefs, feelings, and activities of the parents themselves when it comes to the intergenerational transmission of religious faith and practices. So, the book is focused primarily on religious parents' views on religious transmission. Okay, so that's the overall theme for the book. I think there are two big useful takeaways that I got from this book. One is we see those practices that are most effective in transmitting our faith to our kids. I think we all have an interest in knowing what those are, right? So we're going to talk about those today. But I think this book also serves as a cautionary tale. This is the other takeaway that I got. Because when you look at the attitudes of the typical American religious parents in America today, it does not line up with Christian orthodoxy. Partly, there's overlap there, but there's some crucial elements of the gospel that are just missing from how most American parents understand the practices of religious transmission. So we're going to take a look at those attitudes as well. But one of the key takeaways from the book is you guys do, as parents, you have the crucial role in shaping the religious lives of your kids, more so than any other influence in their life. That role is yours. That burden is upon you. Here's another opening paragraph from the book. Some readers might be surprised to know that the single most powerful causal influence on the religious lives of American teenagers and young adults is the religious lives of their parents, not their peers, not the media, not their youth group leaders or clergy, not their religious school teachers. Myriad studies show that, beyond a doubt, the parents of American youth play the leading role in shaping the character of their religious and spiritual lives, even well after they leave home and often for the rest of their lives. Now, I suspect that for most of you, perhaps all of you, those words come as a comfort, as an encouragement to you that, okay, so I actually am playing a significant role in the religious life of my kids. That's great. But it might also cause some anxiety too, because you're thinking, I don't want to mess this up. I think both of those responses are appropriate. I think there should be a sense of comfort and a little bit of anxiety that comes with that. But we're going to unpack what do the social sciences teach us about how this happens and what are the most effective practices. Now, right up front, they say other sociologists have established pretty decisively what are the practices that most successfully lead to the transmission of religious faith from one generation to the next. Here's what the sociologists tell us. Parent-child relationships that are characterized as warm and affirming relations, those are far more likely to be successful in transmitting religious faith. So if you have a warm and affirming relationship with your kids, as opposed to cold, critical, distant, or neglectful, or abusive, that's probably pretty common sense, right? If you have a good relationship with your kids, they're more likely to continue in your faith. Also, the quality of conversations you have about religion with your kids. That is a crucial element of religious transmission. We're going to have much more to say today about the quality and type of conversations you have with your kids when it comes to religion. One aspect of those conversations that's important for successful religious transmission is that they are children-centered conversations. That is, it's not just you as the parent giving a monologue to your kids, telling them all the religious facts that they need to believe. It should be a two-way conversation where the kids are invited to ask questions of their own and to share their own thoughts with you. And so it's a dialogue. That is the most effective type of conversation that will lead to the successful transmission of a religious faith. Another element that we've discovered is fathers are hugely important. So if the dads are active in the religious lives of their kids, that is a very significant factor in determining whether the kids will grow up to be in the faith as well. That's not to say that the mothers are irrelevant, but social sciences have shown that fathers play a determinative role. Also, this is also probably pretty common sense. When parents share the same religion, that will help set them up for success in transmitting their faith to their kids. Two-parent households, which we talked about when I covered the book Them Before Us. Far more than any other family structure. Single parents, step families. You can transmit the faith in those other types of family environments, but they're just not as successful. Like the numbers show, The most successful path to religious transmission for kids is when they are raised by their married biological parents. Also, grandparents. So for those of you that have entered your empty nest years or your grandparent years, I have words of encouragement for you today as well. You play an important role in the religious lives of your grandkids as well. Many of those who self-reported as being highly religious said that their grandparents played an important role, even if the parents were not as actively engaged in the religious faith. So parents can actually, or grandparents can step in and fulfill that role successfully. So I hope those are words of encouragement to you as well. They also emphasize the importance of moderate levels of religious socialization. I would like to know more about what they mean by moderate levels of religious socialization. But what they mean by that is if you entirely neglect religious involvement, like you don't attend church, you're not going to be successful in passing on the faith. But also if you're overbearing in requiring your kids to attend every possible religious function, that can have detrimental effects as well. I'd like to know more about where is that line, what counts as overbearing, but they didn't report on that. And also, this is probably another no-brainer, parental consistency. Are you actually practicing what you preach as a parent? If your kids see hypocrisy in you, like you tell them that religion is important, but you don't live it out in your own life, that will undermine your efforts to transmit your faith to them as well. So that's all stated up at the beginning of the book. This is not the focus of the book. They're saying this is what other scientists have already discovered in their studies on religious transmission. Yes, John?
How are they defining religion?
Yeah, very broadly. Yeah, so in fact, that leads to the next slide here. Here is what they mean by religion. They mean it in the broadest sense possible. And what they did in studying for this book and researching for this book is they conducted interviews with 215 religiously affiliated parents. Now, religion there is categorized into these groups: white conservative Protestants, mainline Protestants, black Protestants, white Catholics, Latino Catholics, conservative Jews, Mormons, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. So they're trying to take a wide cross-section of religious demographics in America. So they're not necessarily focusing specifically on, evangelical, Protestant, or Christian religion. Christian Smith himself is Roman Catholic, as I recall. I don't know the religious affiliation of Amy Adamczyk. But they also, as a control sample, they interviewed 20 non-religious parents as well. And so the approach they use in reaching their conclusions in this book, it's a method called stratified quota, where basically they're trying to take a sampling of different groups that align economically, religiously, racially, ethnically, geographically. They're trying to get a sampling of all of these factors in the mix. So to ensure that the results are reliable across the board when we're talking about religion in America. So yeah, when we discuss religion in this book, we're talking about the broadest possible sense of religion, not necessarily Christian orthodoxy.
Atheism is a worldview. It's just as much a
Sure.
religion as any religion.
So yeah, the way they define it is basically according to parents' self-reporting. The criteria they use would be, do they attend religious services regularly? Do they report that religion is an important part of their lives? So those are the criteria. These are the sociological criteria. No, we're not getting into theologically accurate definitions of religion, though. But that is setting us up for the overall flow of the book. So what I'm going to do with you guys today is cover some of these chapters in more detail than others. I don't think I'm really going to have much at all to say about chapters 5 and 6, but there are some important elements, especially in the first 2 chapters, that I want to highlight with you guys. And so we're going to begin by looking at some of the cultural models of American religious parents. Now, you guys all have the printout? Did you grab the printout on your way in? So that whole chapter is summarized in those 2 pages that I gave to you. All of those key elements that you see in that definition of the dominant cultural model can be summarized, though, in this one paragraph here. So most religiously affiliated parents in America define the task of intergenerational religious transmission in these terms. Now, these are the results of their interviews. This is the author's attempt to summarize their findings from these hundreds of interviews that they conducted. Their conclusion is that intergenerational religious transmission is the idea that parents are responsible for preparing their children for the challenging journey of life. during which they will hopefully become their best possible selves and live happy, good lives. Does that kind of sound like moral therapeutic deism to you? Yeah, that is confirmed by their interviews here. Religion provides crucial help for navigating life's journey successfully, including moral guidance, emotional support, and a secure home base. So parents should equip their children with knowledge of their religion by routinely modeling its practices, values, and ethics, which children will then hopefully absorb and embrace for themselves. So as you see this definition of religious transmission, there might be elements where you're like, okay, yeah, I could accept that, but there are some crucial things that are missing from this definition, right? What do you see is missing from this definition of religious transmission?
Ultimate destiny.
Ultimate destiny. That is not a priority for most American religious parents. The idea of what comes after death does not factor into their definition of the importance of intergenerational religious transmission. Theological truth does not rank very high in this definition either. It's mostly about a utilitarian approach to religion. How can religion help set you up for a successful life here and now? Your best life now, right? That is how most American religious parents understand their task of handing on the faith. And so what they did in the book, and what I've done for you here, is they created a chart or a graph that shows how all these different cultural models fit together to explain that definition of intergenerational religious transmission. So think of those arrows as sort of like a cause and effect sequence. Okay, so it begins with a fundamental understanding of the purpose of life and the nature of life as a journey. Now, as Christians, would we say that life is a journey? Sure. I mean, I think immediately of like Pilgrim's Progress, right? One of the great works of classical Christian literature. Yeah, the Christian life can be described as a journey. The problem is if that's the only description of what life is about, we're missing the centrality of God, right? It's about us, right? It's about my journey, right? It's about my self-discovery. And we're going to see that is a central element in Americans' understanding of the meaning of life. But that is then informing the parents' understanding of their task as parents, as well as their understanding of religion's value and the truth value. Many religions, now conservative Protestants are more likely than other religious traditions to highlight the exclusive truth claims of their religious faith. That is less the case in mainline Protestant churches or even Roman Catholic churches and other religious traditions like Hinduism, for example. But most American religious parents do say it's about the religion's value is in how it sets you up for a successful life. And so that is also connected to parents' understanding of the nature of children, the importance of family solidarity, why parents should transmit religion to their children, how parents should transmit religion, and the role of religious congregations in that process. All of these cultural models are defined on that printout for you. We could spend the entire we're not in class today. The entire lesson today talking about each of these elements. But I printed it for you, and here's your homework, okay? I want you to look at that printout with your family, with your spouse. Read those definitions of each of these cultural models and try to evaluate them. Where are they correct and where do they fall short? You're going to find a little bit of both in each of those. So I'm going to move forward because there's a lot more to cover in this book. Chapter 2, though, talks about parent religiousness and parenting styles and intergenerational religious transmission. So exactly what parenting styles are most effective in transmitting the religious faith. Now, psychologists have identified 4 major parenting styles. And these 4 major parenting styles can be defined by the level of your expectations and strictness for your kids, and also the level of warmth and responsiveness towards your kids. So we can create a Punnett square here to define these 4 different parenting styles. The authoritative style would be high expectations, but also high level of warmth. The authoritarian style would be high expectations, but low level of warmth, so colder, less responsive. The permissive parenting style would be high when it comes to warmth and responsiveness, but low when it comes to expectations and strictness. And then the less engaged, or also known as the neglectful model, would be low expectations and also colder and unresponsive. So here's my question to you. Which of those do you think is the most successful in transmitting religious faith?
Authoritative.
Authoritative, absolutely. Yes, and the science backs that up. Like the surveys, the research all shows that the authoritative model is the most effective model in transmitting religious faith to your kids, of whatever religious tradition it might be. So that was something that they highlighted in this chapter, in addition to the most important factor. So if you want to know, like the big takeaway from today, what is the most significant practice you can do as a parent to successfully transmit your faith to your kids? It's talking about your faith regularly. More so than religious church attendance, more so than personally practicing it in your own life, the most important factor, far and away, is talking regularly about your faith throughout the week with your kids. That's it. If you do that, that is the most significant predictor that your kids will embrace the faith in their adult years as well. Now, there are other very important variables as well. Church attendance really does matter. Stable families really does matter. And so all those things are significant, but just numerically speaking, talking about your faith regularly matters the most. And so this is what they say in this chapter. In fact, parents talking is even more strongly associated with religious importance, as reported by adult children, than either increased parents' importance of faith or more frequent religious service attendance, both of which we already know to be major influences. So this is the factor. This is the biggest decisive factor in ensuring that you will be most likely to succeed in passing on your faith to your kids. Just talk about your faith regularly, because that's what shows them that it's important to you and that it applies to all of life. And so chapter 3 talks about why parents in particular. So I said, at the beginning of the book, they said that parents are the most important factor in shaping the religious lives of their kids. It's not their friends, it's not classmates, it's not teachers, it's not pastors, it's not social media. It is parents. Why would that be? Well, the authors identify a few factors here. The biggest factor is simply the fact that you have more time with your kids than anyone else does. Right? So you're going to be the biggest influence simply because you spend the most time with them. There's also what they call cultural buy-in. Contrary to the popular stereotypes of previous generations, relations between kids and parents today is generally very positive. Kids are generally, by default, more inclined to follow the cultural lead of their parents, more so than in previous generations, actually. So like the baby boomer generation, there was more antipathy between the generations. But that's not so much the case anymore. Kids are generally more willing to follow the lead of their parents when it comes to cultural and religious practices. The other factor for why parents are so important is because they're the ones who talk about religion with them more frequently than anyone else as well. And in those conversations, it's not just quantity, but it's also quality. The types of conversations matter as well. The authors use the analogy of learning a foreign language. Now, many of you guys already know this, but I'm a huge fan of Duolingo. Any Duolingo users here? Okay. So, in 5 to 10 minutes a day, you can learn a foreign language, right? But I've been learning German now for 3 years on Duolingo. Am I anywhere close to fluent in German now? No. Because I'm only spending 5 to 10 minutes a day on it, right? And so I'm by no means fluent. What would it take for me to become fluent in German? Go there. Immersion, right? That is the most successful way of learning a foreign language. Turns out that's also the most successful way of picking up a religious faith as well, right? It's immersion. So when you are talking about the importance of faith in daily life, you're seeing all these connections. You're translating your experiences of everyday life into religious significance. And that is very much like learning a second language. So parents who talk regularly with their kids about the importance of religious faith are essentially transmitting another language to their kids. And that language will then become second nature to them. That's normally the way this works out. That's why parents are so important. There's another reason why parents have become so important, especially in recent generations. It's because of a major generational change that has occurred in cultural attitudes. So this is where the authors, they come up with their own hypothesis to explain why have parents become so central to the process of religious transmission. This is new, by the way. The importance. Let me back up. Parents have always been important. They have not always been this important. Why have they become this important? Especially when that, with the rise of social media, you might think that they've declined in importance. It's not the case, though. They're actually more important now. Here's the author's attempt to explain why. Because essentially our culture has shifted from understanding religion as a community solidarity project to a personal identity accessory. And so I've put this graph on your printout. I think it's on the final page of your printout as well. So you can take a look at that on your own time. But you can see how have cultural attitudes shifted. What's the purpose of religion? Well, in the traditional community solidarity project model, the purpose of religion is so that you would live rightly, grounded in true beliefs and right practices. So it's rooted in the true and the good. But as a personal identity accessory, religion is about therapeutic coping practices. It's about making good choices in life. What do people need from religion? Like, what do ourselves need from religion? Traditionally, that was thought to be formation in the good. But now it's about authenticity, right? Your pursuit of religion is about living an authentic life. As I read through this graph, I was reminded of a book that I read recently by Carl Trueman. You guys know who Carl Trueman is, right? So he's written a couple important books in recent years. There's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and then the slimmed down version of that same book called Strange New World, where he talks about the rise of a new concept of the self that can be described as expressive individualism. Have any of you heard of the concept of expressive individualism before? It's the idea that life is about discovering who you truly are. It's about living authentically. It's about looking inward to know how to live outwardly as you engage the world. So it's not about submitting to a transcendent truth that stands above you. It's not about embracing the traditions that you have inherited. Basically, think about the moral of every Disney movie. That is expressive individualism, okay? Following your heart, even if that requires you to go against your family tradition and background. So that is what we mean by expressive individualism. And that's essentially the way people understand the role of religion today, is within that expressive individualist framework. So that's why the authors describe religion today as a personal identity accessory. So that also explains the change in understanding for religious congregations. In the traditional model, they were understood to be centers of faith's local community life. But in the personal identity accessory model, they are supportive associational resources. They are there to equip you to find your true self and to live authentically. Religious epistemology. You guys know what the word epistemology means? How do we know what we know? How do we discover the truth? The sources of knowledge in the traditional model were revelation, tradition, reason, experience, and a conditional trust in your religious authorities. In other words, your religious authorities are innocent until proven guilty. The default is to trust them unless they've abused their trust or lost their trust. But in the modern model, the personal identity accessory model, epistemology is about individual personal opinion, subjectively felt preferences. To thine own self be true. Social ontology of religion. I know they're using some big words here. They're sociologists, though. Ontology, just what it is, the nature of what religion is, socially speaking. In the traditional model, it was the authoritative carrier of a tradition. But in the newer personal identity accessory model, it's an optional lifestyle accessory. And this is bringing it back to parenting. What's the role of the home and family? Traditionally, they were seen to be crucial anchor institutions. They served a crucial role in transmitting those religious traditions. But in the modern model, they are considered to be an incubator of possibilities. And I'm going to come back to that concept in just a moment. The mode of growth in the traditional model is participation, solidarity, and practices. But in the modern model, it's about self-reflexivity, which I'm going to define in just a moment, self-assessment, and self-expression. So that lines very much up with the concept of expressive individualism.
Religion as a life coach and therapist.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. That right column, which is how most American religious parents approach religion today, religion is like a life coach and a therapist. That's absolutely right. Yep. Yeah, John.
In the Middle East, where they have much more traditional.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think especially, Middle East and Far East, I think, are still in the community solidarity project concept. Very much so. But the West and America in particular, we've shifted towards this personal identity accessory model. Yeah.
Which shows our digression.
Right. Yeah. Now, there are pros and cons to that model. I mean, there's a lot to critique there. But I think, the freedoms that we now experience, there's a lot that we can be grateful for. the ability to pursue a job of your choosing, to pursue a spouse of your choosing. There's a lot more freedom we have, not to mention all the modern technologies that we enjoy as well. But that's a double-edged sword, right? There are costs that come with that as well. They also talk about this concept of privatization, because one of the common misconceptions that people have had in recent decades is that we're on this inexorable path of secularization as a society. That was a very popular conception of the social scientists back in like the 60s and 70s. You guys might remember how like the New York Times ran the article that said God is dead back in the 1960s. What current research has been showing is that we're not necessarily moving in a like more strictly secular materialistic direction, although that is on the rise. But we are moving more in the direction of religious pluralism. But religion is still an important driving force in the lives of many people today, and in America today as well. So when we talk about the privatization of religion, that can be taken in two different ways. We can use the word privatization to talk about how religion is excluded from the public square, that like our political and social institutions should be kept religiously neutral. That's not actually representative of the direction as a whole that we're moving in. People still very much are active in allowing their religious commitments to influence their role in politics and society in general. But they argue there is another way in which privatization is happening. They argue our observation is that lack of privatization at the macro level, like at the political level, is entirely compatible with powerful privatization at the micro level. Religion may visibly assert itself in social movements and political policy debates on the macro plane, yet simultaneously reconstitute itself in psychologized, therapeutic, and domesticated terms as a personal lifestyle accessory at the private, personal, and family levels. So at the local level, at the family level, yes, religion has become more privatized, even if it still vocally asserts itself at like the macro level, the political level. And so here's how they go on to describe that privatization process. Religion morphing across the 20th century from being a communal solidarity project to a personal identity accessory creates a sociocultural context in which, among other things, the burden of religious socialization becomes laid primarily on the shoulders of parents. This is why parenting has become more central to the process of religious transmission. That might be counterintuitive. You might think that as we move towards this personal identity accessory understanding of religion, parents become less relevant. It's the opposite, though. Parents actually become more relevant in this model. The authors go on to say religious communities in this scenario become no longer authoritative centers of communal solidarity, but associational resources from which parents may draw help in their task if desired. So, parents are becoming more central. Churches less so. The community, less so. Your neighbors, less so. Like in our day and age, I bet many of you don't even know the names of a lot of your neighbors, right? I mean, I don't either, so I'm right there with you, okay? Often, like when it comes to our religious practices, how often does the question, what do my neighbors think, factor into your decision making? Like your immediate next door neighbors? Probably not at all, right? But that is not at all what the case used to be in like the pre-modern world. So, although these other sources are becoming less significant in religious formation, like neighborhoods and communities and churches, parents are playing an outsized role. They're an increasingly significant role in the religious formation of their kids. Connected to that is this concept of self-reflexivity. So here's how they define this concept. Self-reflexivity means making oneself the object of conscious scrutiny and evaluation. Asking questions like, how am I doing? What do I care about? Am I being my true self? Why am I feeling this way? Should I be making different choices? Is there something important I'm missing? Self-reflexivity involves the continual bending back of the influences of one's actions and practices upon oneself. I should highlight, self-reflexivity is not narcissism. It can be, but it can also lead to like a loss of self-esteem or negative self-talk, self-criticism. And so it could be the very opposite. What we mean by self-reflexivity is a higher level of introspectiveness, right? Looking more inward to determine the direction of your life, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. But that is a more prominent phenomenon today. And not only that, but there's no avoiding it. Because of the religiously and culturally pluralistic world that we're living in now, our social and religious life can no longer be taken for granted. It is now something that we have to self-consciously choose for ourselves. So we cannot avoid this self-reflexivity. We're all doing it, especially as we see the decline of the influence of Christianity in our society, which is happening. I saw a hand up. Was that you, Steve?
Perspective, I like that word. People just naturally doing this, like instinctively.
Yeah. It's a natural consequence of the world we're living in today.
Okay.
Like, we can't avoid this. It's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. It's what is happening, like it or not. And because of that, that actually factors into why parents are so important in the process of religious transmission. Here's why. Okay, so this leads to this concept of the home as an incubator of possibilities. So take everything I've already said about, personal identity, accessory, self-reflexivity, expressive individualism. What role is the home in that new cultural context? As raising children has traditionally been understood, the family seems, in certain ways, to have become a weaker, less important agent of socialization. Yet, in its new role, the family has become all the more crucial. Most important, personal cares, subjective meanings, and skills of self-reflexivity are formed at home. But again, what it now means to be a good parent is not to fit children into a received society, but to equip them with the tools needed for their self-development and self-direction in a future that is unpredictable and will itself be ever-changing. This is also why talking to your kids about your faith is so important. Because religious truth can no longer be taken for granted. We have to think through it. We have to justify it. We have to defend it. You, as parents, are now in the role of an apologist for your faith as well. If you can do that well, though, you will ensure that your kids will be firmly rooted in a genuine conviction in their religious beliefs. Because one of the dangers of the earlier model, the Community Solidarity Project, was you believed it because everybody else did. That would breed nominalism, that would breed hypocrisy, formalism, Pharisaism. But in this new cultural and religious environment that we're living in, we are now set up to ensure that our kids will authentically live out our faith.
Dude, it's kind of because God says so, right?
Yeah.
And so you get down to that, and you're like, well, it's in the Bible, so
Right.
there.
But
God
then
says so. And you're
right,
like, well, that's
yeah.
not good enough. Right.
Right, yeah. So, then the question they would ask is, well, how do I know I can trust the Bible? Or how do I know God says that? And so those are those deep level questions that as parents we're going to need to be ready for.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you have to have the answer on the spot. But it does mean saying, that's a really good question. Let's figure it out together. Let's talk with somebody who does know about that stuff. Take them to me. I love talking about that stuff. Yes, John.
That part's really, really important, Kyle.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So kind of to repeat that for the recording, even if you don't have all the answers as a parent, at least you can model to them that the truth is out there and it can be found and you're willing to pursue it with them.
Like, that's new to me.
Right. The truth is transcendent. It's not just inward, right? It's not something I define for myself. But that is not something we can take for granted anymore. We need to model that and teach that to our kids. Right? Yeah, the truth is something to be discovered. Yes. All right, we're coming close to the end here. There was just one or two more important points I wanted to talk about with you guys. The big picture of American religious parenting. This chapter is about like the expectations and desires and fears of parents when it comes to passing on the faith to their kids. This was something that struck me. Of the list of 15 possible parental fears offered on the survey that was given to these parents, the fear of children losing religious faith ranked 10th. Far below kidnapping, sexual exploitation, serious accidents, addictions, lack of ambition, and financial failure, among other concerns. And above their fear of being odd or only average or homosexual. What do you guys think of that listing, that ranking?
Sad at the same time.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said about fear in the first place, right? Because the Bible repeatedly tells us to do not fear, right? Don't be afraid. However, I think there is a healthy place for fear in our lives, right? Now, what the Bible says regarding don't fear, it means don't be ruled by fear. Don't let fear be the driving principle in your life, right? Allow God's provision to take precedence. But, hypothetically speaking, if I were to leave my toddlers at home all day to fend for themselves, should I be afraid of the outcome?
Yes.
Yes, right? So Fear is a healthy safeguard against recklessness, right? There is a responsible use of fear in our lives, and we call that prudence, okay? And so when we're ranking fears, I think there's an appropriate way to do this. And I think when we're evaluating the fears in our lives, there's at least two things we need to take into consideration. The probability that outcome would happen, and also how bad that outcome would be, right? So like, for example, kidnapping. What's the probability that our kids would get kidnapped?
Very low.
Pretty low, very low. What's the probability that our kids will lose their faith?
Probably higher than that.
You want to know the numbers? I looked it up. This was not in the book, but I looked it up. Generation Z. You see right here, the 19%, that's those who left their religious faith. So Gen Z would be those born around or after 2000. So we're talking about 1 in 5 will walk away from their faith. Now, the good news is that number's lower for evangelical Protestants. It's about 11%, I think, for evangelical Protestants. But that's still a pretty high number. Much higher than the risk of kidnapping. So we need to think about what are the things that cause us fear. And how are we ordering our lives accordingly? So we do need to think about the real threats that are facing our kids, and we need to act appropriately and reasonably and biblically in response to those threats. That was the takeaway I got from that point.
Even registers on the same scale.
Absolutely. That ranking of fears does not take into account the afterlife. And that is a big problem for American religious parents.
Which I think
Yeah.
should always be our prayer. I mean, it should be number one.
It should be.
Our children love the Lord.
Yes.
Nothing else matters.
Yep, that's right. All those other things could happen, but if they love Jesus, in the eternal scheme of things, it'll be okay. Right. That's right. Teach them to love the Lord. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip past this section about parents' expectations of religious congregations, but you can see the list of the things that parents typically want from their church. Generally speaking, parents have pretty low expectations for their church. That's a ranking of the things that they want from their church. You can see that programs for kids and youth ranks much higher if they have kids versus if they don't. Sadly, adult Sunday school classes ranked last. It doesn't even make it on this list. So, yeah, that broke my heart. Moral instruction, there's a quote there. I'll put this on the recording so you can read that for yourself later, but I want to jump to the conclusion here. If there were only one practical takeaway from our research, it would be this. Parents need not only to walk the walk, but also regularly to talk with their children about their walk, what it means, why it matters, and why they care. And this brings us back to, I think, one of the central biblical texts about parenting. Deuteronomy 6. Okay? Are you guys familiar with this passage? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. Talking about your faith to your kids is the most important thing you can do for them. Okay? It's in the Bible. Right? And so I think this is a great way for us to conclude the whole class as well. This is an exhortation and encouragement to you as parents as you seek to raise your kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So with that said, I'm done. We have made it. Do you guys have any final questions or thoughts for me? Or I can close this in prayer.
Is this, at least the first part of that, commonly memorized?
It is. It's the most frequently memorized Jewish creed. It's called the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for hear. Yeah. All right. Well, let me close this in prayer, and then we can get ready for corporate worship. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this class. We thank you for the lessons that we have learned through it. And we thank you, Lord, that your truth guides us. We thank you that you have equipped us by your word and by your spirit to undertake the task of parenting. And so I pray, Lord, that our labors would bear fruit in the lives of our children. And I pray, Lord, that you would bless the parents here in this congregation and that we could support one another in this noble task. And so I pray, Lord, that you would teach us to rely on your grace and your truth. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.